thank all of you for coming tonight. I've never seen such wet weather for one of our big events. Many of you will know that this is the 200th anniversary of the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, so 1824. And because of that, we're having some special events this year. And one of them is the Extraordinary Women series. And so this is number 2 in the series, but we're all sold out for Saturday. So if you've already got a ticket, you're in luck. So I'll turn it over to Tony.
Right. Well, of course, you could always attend Saturday online. Well, welcome to this lecture. I'm Tony Symes. I organise lectures for the Herschel Society, and this time it's in conjunction with Betty's Extraordinary Women programme, which we're very glad to contribute to. So tonight we have the title Ada Lovelace, the Making of a Computer Scientist, and the lecturer, Professor Ursula Martin of Wadham College, Oxford. Please note that this lecture is being recorded. Another date of interest is Saturday, the 8th of June, when we're having an all-day conference on John Herschel. And our next lecture will be on Wednesday, the 3rd of April, and will prepare us for the conference. The title will be Introduction to John Herschel. The lecturer will be Dr. Emily Winterburn. Why John Herschel? Well, we're calling him the last polymath, and you'll have to attend these talks to see if we're right to do so. In any event, his work ranged over a number of areas, including astronomy and the chemistry of photography and much else. Now I'm going to hand over to Chris Budd of the University of Bath to introduce tonight's lecturer.
Thank you very much. Well, it's, I think, a mark of the distinction of our lecturer today that she requires 3 people to introduce her. So, yes, I'm Chris Budd. I'm Professor of Mathematics at the university here, and I'm also one of the directors of the BRLSI. And when the other directors, well, when we kind of spoke about the Extraordinary Women series, it was natural that we should think of Ada Lovelace, one of the founders of computer science, to come along. But also very natural for me to think that we should invite Ursula Martin to be the speaker. Ursula Martin is retired, but Professor of Computer Science and Mathematics. She was at Edinburgh, now at Oxford. And she's written one of the foremost treatises actually on Ada Lovelace and is a real expert on Ada Lovelace. But Ursula is also an extraordinary woman herself, one of the world's leading computer scientists. She was, I can't quite remember when, but fairly recently awarded CBE for her work in computer science. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Ursula, who's going to tell us about another extraordinary computer scientist, Ada Lovelace.
Well, thank you, everyone. Who's driving the Zoom? You'll have to tell me if I'm standing in the right place for the camera.
Well, you want to be standing pretty close to the lecture microphone, not too close. It's very directional.
Well, you'll have to tell me if I'm in the right place, because you see, I can't see the Zoom picture on that screen.
No, we can see you fine on the Zoom image.
Oh, well, hello, Zoom audience. I'm amazed to hear there is somebody tuning in from Japan, where, if I'm right, it's now tomorrow. So anyway, it's great to be here and to be helping you celebrate the 200th anniversary of the BRLSI. I've just been looking at some of the bullet points down here of what it's got up to in its 200 years. A few years ago, I had the great pleasure of organising the celebrations for Ada Lovelace's 200th birthday. And the reason I got landed with that is that I was based in Oxford, and the Bodleian Library has a wonderful collection of Ada Lovelace's archive. And they looked around for somebody to help tell the story. And somehow they landed on me, possibly because I said, wow, that would be amazing. And a lot of other people said, oh, well, that would be a lovely job for somebody else. And so as a result, I got to work with amazing people in the library and archives and two collaborators, Adrian Rice and Chris Hollings, and we produced several articles and a book, which would be on sale in the foyer, except it's out of print, but we were very pleased about that. Well, if you've heard about Ada Lovelace, you've probably heard her claimed as being something like the world's first programmer, the first ever computer scientist. You may have heard about her as being the daughter of Lord Byron. You may have heard about Ada Lovelace on a stamp. You may have gone online and looked to buy Ada Lovelace gin or Ada Lovelace socks. You may have, thank you. Is the next one going to work? I'm not making it up about the gin or the socks. I would be wearing the socks, but it's rather cold. And the portrait, the great big portrait I showed. Oh, no, I'm not allowed to move, am I? This is dreadful. I'm the kind of lecturer who likes to walk around a lot. If I do that, you know, that's cruel to the online audience, isn't it? Right, I'll stand here. The wonderful portrait I showed you was actually painted by a woman, an artist called Margaret Carpenter, and it's in the government art collection. And for several prime ministers have had, you know, the school photo taken in front of it. I couldn't actually find a Sunak or a Truss school photo, but I could find that one, and I could find Theresa May. But there they are, sitting in front of it, because she's become this awfully useful symbol. You know, if you want to show that you're doing something about women in science, wheel on Ada Lovelace. And there are these remarkable collection of books about her. Well, if you're writing a book for kids, of course, you have to simplify. You have to leave out some of the racier aspects of her life. And quite often I've given up complaining. I used to read them, saying, that's wrong. But it's like saying, well, there's something wrong on the internet, you know. Some of them are beautifully produced books. So she's often called the first programmer. And the reason is because of this thing. Now, what on earth is that thing? It sort of looks like a spreadsheet with algebra in it, doesn't it? It's often called the first computer program. If you go away remembering one thing, it's not a computer program, and even if it was, it isn't the first, if you see what I mean. And that was part of a quite extraordinary article that she published in 1843. The article was the translation of an article by an Italian scientist called Menabrea. The article was written in French. Lovelace translated it and added a great deal of material of her own. The material she added, the material of her own was about 60 pages of appendices attached to 15 pages of the original article. And that's the work that has attracted all the attention, and that's where not the first program is. And what the paper was about, well, it was about the analytical engine invented by Charles Babbage Esquire, and we'll come on to Charles Babbage Esquire and his analytical engine in a moment. She was kind of forgotten for a long time, but she was sort of resurrected actually in the early days of computing in the 1950s. There was a book called Faster Than Thought by somebody called Bowden, and anybody in computer science of a certain age, older than most of you in the room, who started getting interested in these newfangled computers in the 1950s, probably had a copy of Faster Than Thought. And it had, as a frontispiece, a picture of Ada Lovelace and a long article about her, because Bowden was trying to do exactly what the Downing Street PR people are trying to do. He was using Lovelace, using an aristocratic woman, as she was, as a sort of symbol of Britishness, a symbol of British technological expertise. It was quite interesting. This was the days when, You know, if you were trying to sell a sports car, you would park it outside a stately home with photographed with an aristocratic young woman draped over it. It was the same cast of minds. That is how people got to know about her. So when's all this happening? It's happening in the early part of the 1843. It's happening in the middle of the 19th century. What was going on in Britain in the middle of the 19th? Stand still, woman, stand still. This is a picture of the Great Exhibition of 1851, which, if you don't know, took place in a massive suite of glass buildings built on the site of where Imperial College now is in South Kensington. It was a huge trade show. It was meant to be demonstrating British prowess in manufacturing, in the arts, in engineering, frankly, the exploitation of the colonies up there. You've got cotton, you've got scientific instruments, you've got china and glass, you've got all sorts of things. It was demonstrating British prowess. And if you think what that prowess rested upon, well, what did you need for all that prowess? Well, fundamentally, you needed an awful lot of mathematics. You needed navigation. You were shipping things around the world. You needed finance. You needed banking. You needed insurance. You needed engineering. You needed, and not just handcrafted manufacturing, but precision manufacturing, engineering manufacturing. You needed an awful lot of mathematics, of calculation, and that was all done. If you think back to your Dickens, it was all done by clerks sitting there, writing things by hand. It's a massive, mostly male, although a few women started to be employed in certain kinds of. Now, what did they have to help them? Well, one of the things they had to help them was log tables. Now, who in the room is old enough to remember log tables? Go on, yes. Well, there you go. If you're not, turn to the person next to you. Now, when I say remember, I want to give you, if you were to give me some log tables and say, okay, use those then. Well, I've got a crib sheet here, but so it's going to work without blinding something. No. Sorry, audience. Supposing you want to multiply 15, which is up there at the top blue arrow, 20, which is in the middle blue arrow. What do you want to multiply 15 by 20? Well, you do it in your heads. Don't look like that. You see, next to 15 is a little number, 0.1761. Next to 20 is another one, 0.3010. You add those two together and get 0.4771. And then you flick to a different page in the book. Yes, if there is anybody here sort of under 40, we did do it that way. You flick to a different page in the book, look up 4771, and it tells you 30. Well, to do it like that, you know, it's labor intensive in itself, but the tables have to come from somewhere. And Charles Babbage was, we already mentioned John Herschel as a polymath, and we're about to mention him again. But Charles Babbage was another extraordinary polymath, like Mary Somerville, who some of you heard about on Friday. Mathematician, an author, an inventor. And he became obsessed, well, he had many obsessions, but one of his obsessions was thinking about whether you could find a way mechanically of producing these tables, rather than having lots and lots of people sitting there calculating the tables, and then you had to proofread them and so on and so on. Well, in fact, this is the first connection with your hero. Charles Babbage and John Herschel, as you see, were pretty much the same age. They both studied mathematics at Cambridge, discovered a lot of common interests, and they worked together on many scientific projects. And in Babbage's, there's a document where Babbage wrote, as an old man, he wrote a somewhat self-serving autobiography, not all of which, you know, some of it's excusable, but it's not always entirely true. Anyway, and what he said in the, what's written in that piece of very illegible handwriting, top left, is, what he's saying is, well, at some point, Herschel and I were looking at these log tables these draft log tables that we produced, and we thought it's an awful lot of work correcting them and checking them. Maybe we could produce them automatically. Maybe, what if we could, it was suggested by one of us, Babbage is being terribly coy here as to which of him and Herschel suggested it, that it might be possible to do it by steam, to which the other replied that such a thing might be quite possible. And a sentiment in which we both heartily concurred, and there the conversation terminated. So this was sort of the inspiration for Babbage trying to produce these things by steam. While I'm on John Herschel, I'm going to tell you a bit more about Ada Lovelace's paper in a moment because I've jumped ahead. But John Herschel read this paper of Ada Lovelace, and as you see, didn't think very much of it. Right, reading her notes the same kind of way out here when I'm trying to understand any other thing which he explained himself as not clear ideas of. Well, anyone who's been an educator is familiar with reading student work that has that property. So, anyway, back to Babbage and his analytical engine. So Babbage, as I say, became obsessed with trying to design a mechanical calculating engine. And in the archives in Oxford and in the London Science Museum, we have huge quantities of notes and drafts and partial explanations of things as he works towards his glorious idea. The experts know there were actually two different engines, or several different engines, but I'm leaving that bit out. But this is what a typical page of Babbage's notes looks like. Well, if you're looking for things that are hard to understand, it's pretty hard to understand. It's often very hard to understand what he was driving at. But the fundamental principle of his invention, this picture is not contemporary with Babbage, obviously. It's drawn by somebody called Sidney Padua, who's the author of an absolutely wonderful graphic novel called The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage. Anyway, this is her drawing of a realization of the machine that Babbage invented, described, and never built, and Lovelace wrote about. And what's extraordinary about this machine is, well, many extraordinary things, but it follows the same principles as a modern computer. So if I pick up my phone and I decide I am too lazy to work out 15 times 20 for myself, what do I do? Well, obviously, I open up the calculator app. And what do? I type in 15, I type in times, I type in 20, I type in equals, and think that's the answer. Now, what would a computer, what's actually going on under the hood? Well, I'm typing in 15, and it's parking 15 in the memory somewhere. Now, in Babbage's design, how do you type in 15? Well, you have a card which records the number 15, and the card sets one of these columns to 15. Now, what's one of those columns? One of those columns is 100 brass discs. Extraordinary. 100 discs. Each of them is very heavy. Each disc has the numbers 1 to 10 on it, or 0 to 9 to be precise. And so if I type in 15, what the card tells the machine to do is to store 15, set one of these columns to 15. 15. Now I'm typing in times. Well, I can't type in. I'm giving it a card that says times. And so it's taking times away and storing it somewhere. And then I'm typing in 20s. I'm getting another card with 20. So on the second column, it's going recording 20. Then I'm typing equals. What does it do? Well, equals says, okay, machine, now do some sums for me. So it fetches the 15 and the 20, lots of mechanical plugins to fetch the 15 and the 20, bring it over here, which is where the actual calculation takes place, in the same sort of way that, well, not in the same sort of way my phone would do it, but multiply 15 by 20 times 20, well, what you've got to do is add 15 to itself 20 times. So it does all that. And then what's it got to do? Well, it's got to spit out the answer. So it spits that out on well, the Babbage's idea, spit it out on a printer, which is conveniently called Lovelace. So this was Babbage's design. Now, if you start even in this, you know, we're slightly, where did they? Oh, I put it in my pocket. Right. Even in this slightly fanciful representation, well, you can see why it would need to be driven by steam. I mean, just think about the size of it. You know, it was sort of the nearest equivalent complex piece of machinery at the time was perhaps I don't know, a railway engine. But you know, it's many times more complicated than a railway engine. It needed to be driven by steam just because of the size and scale of it. If you think about the engineering of it all, I mean, just think about the, you know, digital happens instantly. This doesn't happen instantly. You've got to have a whole lot of mechanical stuff happening. In the worst case, you've got to have mechanical stuff sort of rippling all the way down. And all the things that can go wrong, just mechanical things can stick, you know? It was hugely complicated. That was what, well, there were many reasons it didn't get built. One, it was too complicated. Two, he fell out with his workmen. Three, he didn't have enough money. And four, actually, although he built simple models of parts of it, his designs weren't quite there. I'll get onto that in a moment. So what's going on in this great big spreadsheet? Well, what this great big spreadsheet is, sorry, reader in Japan. It's quite interesting, actually. You see, I'm completely forgetting I'm on Zoom because on my screen I can't see anything to tell me I'm on Zoom. You know, normally if you're on Zoom, you see a line of little faces. Oh, full screen. So what happens? Well, what this is doing, and it's writing down what happens when you do a more complicated calculation of the numbers of Bernoulli. Well, that would take, you know, quite a lot of maths lessons to explain what they are. But calculating the numbers of Bernoulli, it's explaining it in that same sort of way I just explained multiplying 15 by 20. So it's saying, what if you want to calculate the first number of Bernoulli, B1, which is this there? Well, you've got to give it a bunch of inputs. And the bunch of inputs you've got to give it, they're listed in some in the top. If you start reading it line by line, it says, well, we're going to start off by having V2, V1 and V2, and something's going to happen, and things are going to be put in V4, V5, and V6. And so those V's correspond to those columns of lumps of metal. And so it's saying something's going to happen. You're going to calculate an intermediate result. That's going to be put somewhere. You're going to calculate the next step. You're going to calculate some more results. You're going to go carry on and on and on. And then you're going to get to this thing, B1. And then you're going to take B1 back and put it into calculating the next line. And you're going to get to B3, which is there. And then what's going to happen? Well, this is the thing that's kind of, you look at it, what does it say here? It says, here follows a repetition of operations 13 to 23. So anyone who's a programmer, that's a loop. Here's a loop. Here we're repeating a chunk of code to get to the next step. Now, why am I so keen to tell you it's not a program? I mean, you might think, well, it looks like a program. It's giving it something, and it's spitting something out. Well, it's not really a program because it's just telling you the steps of doing a particular calculation. Just like when I was explaining 15 times 20, I was saying, you do this with the 15 and do this with the 20. There's no notion of programming language. There's no notion of many of the other more complicated things that you actually need in the modern world to program. But it does have a name, and this is, well, I've spoilt the trick. The trick question for the programmers of the audience is, well, what is this? But I've answered it on the slides. It's something which nowadays we would call an execution trace. But it's still pretty remarkable that what she's doing is explaining how this thing works in a way that a modern computing audience understands. And what she says is, this example illustrates how the cards are able to reproduce all the operations which intellect performs in order to attain a determinate result if these operations are themselves capable of being precisely defined. So she's and so what she's doing is she's saying, well, here's a worked example to show you that this machine can compute anything you might want to compute. And you see, so a big thing taken for granted there, which is, you know, because we know about computers, we all know something about computers. We take it for granted that, let's say you wanted a computer to compute tides, and you wanted a computer to compute weather forecasts. Actually, you could use the same computer and just program it differently, one to do the tides and one to do the weather forecasts. And that's actually a very powerful principle about computing. It needed somebody to think of that. And it was Lovelace and Babbage. This is really a joint production. You know, it's not the case that Lovelace suddenly had this inspiration that Babbage hadn't thought of. Babbage had thought of a gazillion things in all those incredibly complicated notebooks. But that idea was then made precise by Alan Turing in 1936. And the experts will have to forgive me because I'm simplifying. You know, sometimes you simplify things and you make it slightly inexact when you do that. But, what Turing showed was that any computer which could do what this machine could do could simulate any possible program. So in principle, the analytical engine was a universal computer in the sense that Turing mentioned it. Well, the analytical engine, if Babbage had designed it properly and not left various crucial gaps, you know, and here's an exercise for the reader, and here's a bit I haven't quite figured out yet, you know. But it is still rather extraordinary that there they were in the middle of the 19th century, and they knew that this was what computation was going to be about. Well, the papers got many other things in it that are rather striking. This one's often quoted. Suppose, for instance, the fundamental relations of pitch sounds in the science of harmony and musical composition were susceptible of such expression and adaptations. The engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any complexity or extent. That's rather extraordinary. So what she's saying is, if you knew how to represent music mathematically, then instead of the machine spitting out numbers, it could spit out notes, or it could spit out things onto scores. And this is this idea, like many of the ideas that Lovelace and Babbage were playing, it didn't really come from nowhere, because there'd been a great interest for a number of years in different kinds of automata and musical boxes. Babbage hated barrel organs. Babbage wanted Parliament to bring in a law banishing barrel organs. And one suggestion is that actually Lovelace put that in there to tease him. Look, your computer could be the biggest barrel organ there ever was. But then other things that have attracted a lot of attention later. The analytical engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. And order is not being used there in the sense of instruct so much as put in order, arrange for a thing to be so. It's a slightly different, I don't mean anachronistic. I mean, it's an older use of the word order. Now, people have lit upon that, and that Turing lit upon that in an article in the 1940s. He called it Lady Lovelace's objection to the idea of can a computer think? And a lot has been written about it in that context. But actually, it's quite important to go back sometimes and look at the context in which this work was being done. Now, the barrel organs, we can make a joke about the barrel organs, but another big context in all this, remember, where are we? We're Britain, well, Scotland was it? Scotland, England, let's stick to England. England in the 19th century. A time of huge religious debate and argument. In the archives of Ada Lovelace and her mother, there's quite a lot of maths. Well, I like the maths. There's also quite a lot of theology. I'm afraid I turned the pages of that rather fast. I can't make head or tail of the theology. But Lovelace was writing this paper partly as a sort of manifesto for Babbage's work, so that people would know about Babbage and the machine and how amazing it was. So if you're taking a position in the argument, can a machine think? Rephrased in 19th century terms, as it was in something called the Bridgewater Treatises, which I don't have time to talk about either. The question you're really asking is, does the machine challenge God, or does the machine help us understand God's work better? Now, if what you're trying to do is to write a manifesto to convince people that this machine is great and maybe the government could lob some more money in Babbage's direction, which position do you adopt? Well, you go for the non-controversial one. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. It's not challenging God, it's helping us understand God's works better, and there's more in similar vein below. But I think this is one of the extraordinary things about this paper is that as a modern computer scientist, you read it, sometimes you have to stop and unpick the 19th century language, but you think, oh, I know what she's talking about. Yeah, of course. But of course, that's reading it as a modern computer scientist. Reading it as Herschel, well, I don't know if there's a bit of casual misogyny there, if Herschel really was completely baffled by it, but it's very, it's a whole area of historical research in itself to understand what's called the reception of these kinds of documents. What did they mean to the people who are reading them at the time, which is very often different from what they mean to us. Well, that's the amazing paper. I could say a lot more about it, but it anticipated many discoveries of modern computing. It articulated Babbage's ideas in a way that was accessible, well, intended to be accessible, and it was quite remarkably prescient in some of the broader concerns it went on to talk about. So I'm now going to change gears slightly and talk about who Ada Lovelace was and how did she have background knowledge to write a paper of this kind. Well, her father was the infamous Lord Byron. It's the 200th anniversary of his death this year, and so there are various celebrations going on. Byron was a kind of rock star poet. He was a best-selling poet of serious and satirical verse, and you don't have to trust me. You just had to read the Daily Mail yesterday. Somebody seems to have written a book. I had to pay money to read what the Daily Mail thought about the book, so I didn't. But he seduced hundreds of women as well as a few men who are now racing new bookings. What turned Lord Byron into a sex addict? Well, there you go. That was Ada's dad. Her mother was a very different kind of person. Her mother was Isabella Millbank, who was the daughter of an aristocratic family basically lived in Northumberland, a liberal family. Her uncle was Lord Melbourne, who was Queen Victoria's first prime minister. She was very interested in science. She was very interested in social matters. She was part of the growing anti-slavery movement in the 1840s. She was interested in philanthropy, and that involved founding schools. She went to Switzerland and studied the work of Pestalozzi and founded various schools in London, one in Ealing, particularly where she lived. Well, how they got together is slightly a mystery. They weren't together for very long. They married on the 2nd of January, 1815. Ada was born in about a year later. They separated a few weeks later. Byron left the country, partly for the reasons indicated on the previous slide, went to fight in the Greek War of Independence, where he died, not on the battlefield, but of some kind of infection he caught. He pilloried his wife unmercifully in Don Juan. When I was at school, our set book for one of our set books for English literature A level was Byron's Don Juan. And so I came across this, Byron being snarky about mathematics, without having any concept of who Ada Lovelace was, or who his daughter was. Her favourite science was the mathematical, her thoughts were theorems. O ye lords of ladies intellectual, inform us truly, have they not henpectual? Groan. Anyway, that is the happy couple, by the way, as sketched by Lady Caroline Lamb, who was his half sister, who he had an affair with. Well, happy couple, not. So Ada Lovelace was brought up by her mother. Now her mother was her mother, well, she had many concerns in bringing up the child. One was that Byron's family would want to take her back because that was how separation worked, the father's right to have the child. And she was very sensitive to criticism that she wasn't bringing her up properly. So what she did was she kept everything. She kept detailed notes of everything. And that's why we now have this fantastic archive about Ada Lovelace's childhood. Every letter was kept. Ada Lovelace predeceased her mother, and when she died, her mother wrote to everybody and collected back all the correspondence. So we have an extraordinary archive. Well, she was an aristocrat. She wasn't sent to one of her mother's schools, but her mother educated her very much according to Pestalozzi's principles. So she learned mathematics, she learned French, she learned embroidery. She was a very imaginative child. Beautiful, neat handwriting for a child of about 10. And this is a letter where she's writing to her mother, who's away from home, which she often was, doing good works of various kinds, and saying, well, I'm thinking about a flying horse. And when I figured out how to build a flying horse, I want to have a flying steam engine. It will be more wonderful than steam packets or steam carriages. It's to make a thing in the form of a horse with a steam engine in the inside, so contrived as to move through the air, and so on and so on. It's wonderfully fanciful. She became fascinated by the anatomy of birds. She drew little pictures of birds. She went through a whole, as kids sometimes do. She had this, well, these days it's often dinosaurs, isn't it? This wasn't dinosaurs. This was how you build a flying horse. And you have to, perhaps I'll interrupt talking about her childhood and her education. Just to reflect a bit on what 19th century science thought the scientific community was like. Well, if you're all members of the BRLSI, then you all know that, because it's this. It is people thinking, it wasn't the case that science had become professionalized and over there in the way it has today. And so there was among people with the education and the leisure to get involved, There was a great interest in things like natural history and astronomy and scientific approaches to agriculture. There were popular lectures, women were excluded from, in England, women were excluded from universities. But that didn't stop them going to public lectures, working as translators, being involved in many aspects of science, and organized. Was the BRLSI, was that were their lectures open to men and women in the 18? Yeah. They were good, yes. So that's like the British Association, which was similar. And this is Humphrey Davy at the lecturing at the Royal Institution. So there was this great popular culture around science, and Lovelace was involved in that. Her mother's connections and background meant she knew people like the Herschels, she knew Babbage, she knew Harriet Martineau, she knew Mary Somerville. There was a whole network of scientific interests. When she married, and I wonder if this is another connection with your organization, she married, she was introduced to William King by Mary Somerville's son, who was a friend of his. William King had estates in Surrey and also on Exmoor, the King family. King, they sometimes called Noel King or Loch King. And they had estates on Exmoor around Porlock. And this is Ashley Combe, which was where Ada Lovelace was a sort of country retreat. Sadly, it's now demolished, but the descriptions of it are that it was a rather eccentric building because, but I do wonder, somebody would have to help me out with what travel was like between Porlock and Bath in the 1840s, we're talking about probably, you know. Slow, yes. Sorry, not as slow as today. Well, but and as I'll mention in a moment, William King's scientific interests were in agriculture, crops, land reform. So there may well have been some sort of connection. They were married in 1835 when Lovelace was 20. They had 3 children in quick succession. And they pursued their scientific interests together. This is in some ways William Lovelace's magnum opus, Climate in Connection with Husbandry. It's quite a long essay, but they're pulling together, he's pulling together all kinds of speculative ideas, but about how you might collect and analyze data before people had the mathematical principles available to analyze data. But in the archives, there's quite a lengthy correspondence with John Herschel, between John Herschel and the Lovelaces about this paper, and in particular about the possibility of using some of Herschel's optical instruments to record light and heat. So in that chart, they're thinking about whether rainfall varies with the phases of the moon. I think people don't think it does anymore, but they were thinking about that. And here's a little footnote by Ada Lovelace. The present object is really to suggest to Monsieur Gathbrin, who's somebody who they criticize him quite a bit in this essay, how accurately the 2 instruments named above, she's like Herschel, the actinograph and the actinometer, which, do you have one in your museum? Yeah. Well, both of them, what they are is they're quite clever. Well, one of them, Herschel confesses he never actually manufactured. He writes a long essay about them. But the idea is you've got an apparatus which includes a bit of photographic paper, but then you somehow want the photographic paper to rotate, or you basically, you know, it's like, imagine, it's more complicated than this, to imagine having like a roll of photographic paper that's going past a slit of light. And then you know, as it goes past, it'll record the state of the light at the moment it passed the light. And so that was supposed to be capturing information about the sun. Lovelace is saying, well, look, you know, the world could turn into citizen scientists doing this sort of thing. Fascinating paper. Well, but I still haven't really got on to how she learned all that maths. How did she learn all that maths to write this paper? When, as far as we know, her maths until that stage, it was sort of good school kid level. She'd learned Euclid, she'd learned to add, subtract, and divide. And the answer is through somebody called Augustus de Morgan, who was also a member of their circle. Augustus de Morgan was a professor at the University College London, had just been founded as one of the first universities in England, apart from Oxford and Cambridge. Augustus de Morgan was a lecturer there, and Lovelace, the kids, you know, we're talking about a wealthy family where the kids could often be passed over to granny or a nanny, or, you know, Lovelace could go off and pursue her own interests. And she really wanted to learn some more advanced mathematics, perhaps because she was starting to talk to Babbage about his engines, starting to think more about astronomy. And she did it through a correspondence course with Augustus de Morgan. Augustus de Morgan, and the correspondence course was at the level of what his undergraduates at University College were learning at the time. And it's an absolutely fascinating document. First of all, because what we're seeing is, you know, we're seeing her learning how to learn mathematics. And this one is a letter where she's been trying to do a problem, and she's writing De Morgan a letter saying, essentially, I am stuck. I mean, what she says is, these functional equations are complete will-o'-the-wisps to me. The moment I fancy I've got the last hold of something tangible, it all flies away into thin air. And then she sort of sets out to explain her working. She's trying to do this problem, and she gets stuck. And she writes to De Morgan saying, I'll try this, and I'll try that, and I'll try that. And it's actually rather lovely as an educator to look at this, because you think, oh, yes, you know, that's what you want a student to, you know, very often if you have well, what I do anyway, if you have a student who's stuck, you get them to explain where they're stuck, because sometimes they figure it out for themselves. And also you get to understand their thought process. You get to, and here, eventually De Morgan has to help her out. The reason she's stuck is because she's doing that other classic thing students sometimes do. She's trying to answer the wrong question. But there's about 400 pages of these mathematical exercises. And it's just fascinating, not only as evidence that she really did understand this advanced maths that she was using in Babbage's machines, but also as to how she learned, how her mind worked. You know, we rarely have that. You know, we rarely have that kind of thing captured. And of course, it's because it's a correspondence course rather than sitting in lectures. Very shortly after this, De Morgan actually started teaching classes in London at the, I think it was called the Queen's College in London. It was one of the first places offering university level education to women. But we've no evidence that Lovelace attended those. So here we have Lovelace. We're now in the 1840s. She's learned this mathematics. She's captivated by Babbage's engine. She's working with Babbage to write this extraordinary paper. And then one sort of says, well, what happens next? Well, what happens next is, sadly, this is 1843. Over the next few years, she became increasingly ill with cancer, uterine cancer that eventually killed her. The treatment to dull the pain was quantities of morphine and opium, and the treatment to counteract the side effects of that was booze. So, you know, she wasn't really in a good state. And some of her writing at the time is a bit wild, shall we say. But she still maintained her intellectual interests. I'm going to miss out that slide because sadly, something has gone wrong with it in the ether. You see, it's not meant to be this strange patchwork. And she continued to think about mathematics, often in quite surprising ways. Here she is saying, writing a letter to Mary Somerville's son, who remained a friend. And she said, well, what if you could use mathematics to understand how the mind worked, how the brain worked? I have my hopes, and very distinct ones too, of one day getting cerebral phenomena such that I can put them into mathematical equations. And that's, I mean, for the period, nobody else is thinking like that. That's extraordinary. I mean, we have no evidence that she got any further than speculating that it might be done. But even speculating that it might be done is rather remarkable. In short, a law or laws for the actions of molecules of the brain equivalent to the law of gravitation for the planetary system. I hope to bequeath to the generations a calculus of the nervous system. Well, she did bequeath to the nations a calculus, but you know, she thought about it. She thought about how you could use mathematics in these extraordinary ways. She retained her friendships even as she became ill. She retained her friendships with Babbage. This is another picture of the Great Exhibition from the outside. And this is almost the last letter she had from, I think it is the last letter she had from Babbage. And it's a letter from Babbage offering to take her to the Great Exhibition in 1851. So that's, you know, just a few months before she passed away. And saying, well, just make sure you wrap up warm and you bring warm cloaks and gloves and hats and everything you can to keep you warm. It's rather sweet. She died, and you know, this archive is stark in the way we have all her mother's notes about how old she was. We have her husband's diary. We even have a little drawing by her mother of Ada Lovelace on her deathbed. And I never like to even use that in lectures. It seems too personal to put up on the screen. Yes, eventually she died in 1852. If you read some of the biographies, they go on a lot about all the different fallings out in the family at the time of her death, but that was obviously difficult for everybody. And she was buried next to her father in Hucknall Church in Nottingham. And then this elaborate memorial was put up at Kirkbury Mallory by her mother. So, you know, she was so how do we sum up Ada Lovelace? Well, she was mathematically talented. She was capable, perceptive, interested in big ideas. She asked hard questions. It was Babbage who did all the work on the analytical engine, produced all the designs, but was never terribly good at explaining to the general public what it was all about. And that's what Ada Lovelace's 1843 paper does. Well, John Herschel may not have liked it, but you know, given the limits of the time, you know, she was doing what nobody else did at the time, what Babbage himself didn't do. He never wrote a clear explanation of it like this. And it's quite remarkable how it captures concerns of the time which are still of interest today. That's me.
Okay, we'll do questions now. We'll start off with the room and then we'll go to the chat channel and see if there are any questions online. Please, could you wait for the microphone and then hold it right up like this, because otherwise the Zoom audience won't be able to hear you at all.
She had 3 children. Did any of the children follow in her footsteps and developed any real interest in mathematics?
Yeah, she had 3 children. Her oldest son went off to join the Navy at a very young age. And then, oh,
the Zoom audience saying they can't hear you.
because I keep walking around, yes. Yes, you should. Right. Yes, her oldest son died at quite a young age. Her daughter studied mathematics. In fact, her daughter may have gone to the Queen's College, either to De Morgan's lectures or somebody else's lectures. There's some very neat notes in the archive, mathematical notes, which are not Lovelace's, there's somebody else's. We think they may be her daughter's. But her daughter then became very famous for breeding a particular kind of Arab racehorse. And there are wonderful pictures of her looking like Lawrence of Arabia. You know, she went out to sorry, wherever you go to get these particular kinds of horses. And then she had a stud, the Crabbit stud, which I think the Crabbit line of horses still keeps going. And in fact, I once gave a lecture like this and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, but you didn't mention the horses. But yes, so I think her daughter had that mathematical sophistication, but we have no evidence she wrote any mathematics.
Thank you for a lovely talk. Obviously, there's great Babbage and Lovelace archives here in the UK. I'm just wondering, are you familiar with the Babbage archive in New Zealand?
I do know a little bit about it, yes.
I've got a copy in my pocket.
Yes.
Anyway, I'll get in contact and I've got a photographic copy of the whole thing.
Yes, yes, I've seen the articles about it, and the yes, do get in touch. These guys have my email. Well, Google will find my email address. Thank you.
Thank you. Great talk. I came to the Mary Somerville talk on Friday as well. And what struck me about both is that these 2 women were superb at explaining things that the men they dealt with maybe were not so good at. Was this sort of a pattern in Victorian life?
It's a good question. I think certainly there were a number of women who, I mean, Mary Somerville made her living by writing textbooks, and Ada Lovelace was party ground to do that. But yes, there were people like Harriet Martineau. There were some names downstairs of people who'd written textbooks, and it was one of the ways in which science was open to women, was to write books of that kind. Yes, I think that's a good point. The other thing women often did is they were illustrators. As people started to do things that needed more and more data analysis, you know, who was summoned in to help with the data analysis? Well, it was the wives, the daughters, and the unmarried sisters. Yes, a good point.
My first cousin, 6 times removed, 5 times removed, was Isabella, Ada's daughter's governess for about 8 years, from 1852. She just overlapped. Well, no, she met and lived for possibly a month or 2 with Ada, but thereafter it was with her father and her grandmother. She lived a lot of the time with her grandmother. And so a lot of this is quite familiar. I know that the daughter, although her lessons with her governess, my relation, well, they would have included, she was she spoke French, German, and Italian, my forebear. But she would have had lessons with mathematicians. I know that. I know that she was having other schooling within her home. And there was a whole, the house was always filled with visitors like the Somervilles and Mary Somerville's son and his family, his wife. They were often at round the dinner table. So I think they had she was a sparky, the daughter was very sparky and inquiring. And I've read her, quite a number of her diaries, as well as the diaries that my forebear wrote. She left 20 diaries, which I've transcribed. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry to keep on,
Sorry,
but
yes.
the Zoom audience really can't. hear.
I'd love to have a chat to you about this. Yes, because we do in the archive have this notebook, which we think from the context and the handwriting, it doesn't actually have a name on it. We think it must be her daughter's mathematical notebook. And we never quite worked, or my colleague who's working on this has never quite worked out how it fitted in, but it looks as if, it doesn't quite look as if she's copying out a textbook, because why would you do that? It looks as if perhaps it's notes from some lectures she went to. But that would fit, or it might be notes that she's written, you know, with a tutor coming into the house. Yes, thank you. That's fascinating.
Hello, you speak a lot about how the women wrote things down. At what point were they allowed to have a voice to actually deliver lectures themselves?
Yes, isn't that a good question? I don't think Mary, so that is a very good question. I mean, obviously, by the time that the women's colleges were founded, but they would probably be having tutorials, and I mean the early women's colleges actually were teaching quite small classes, so they might have a voice and be standing up and talking to a group. And of course, women had been teaching in schools for a long time. I'm trying to think of some of the more campaigning women. I mean, I'm sure Harriet Martineau gave speeches, for example. I'm trying to think if, I mean, there was a big anti-slavery movement in the 1840s. I didn't include it, but there's actually a wonderful portrait, a sort of group portrait of people at an anti-slavery meeting being addressed by Wilberforce, and one of them is Ada Lovelace's mother. But whether women, I have a feeling among this cultured audience, somebody may have a better answer to this that I'm actually managing to produce.
I understood it that Mary Somerville had been possibly a professor in Italy, in Florence, in mathematics. She certainly lived there for a long time in the 1860s.
She certainly lived there for a long time. She certainly mixed with the intellectual community. Whether she would have given lectures, I don't know.
But she was known as a formidable mathematician.
She was known as a formidable mathematician. Yes. She was known as a woman of great intellect, but whether she would have given public lectures, because this all goes with, you know, issues of class and issues of what it was appropriate for women to do.
I thought she was associated with the university in Florence, but I may be wrong.
She may be. I'd have to look that one up. I'd have to look that one up. I mean, women did preach in women do. Sorry, I'm going off to tangent here about this thing because I'm from a family of Quakers, and Quaker women preached extraordinarily early in the 17th, 18th century. Quaker women were preaching. So
Right. I have a question from the chat channel. Duncan Young asks, thank you. Why was the Ada programming language named after her? Any specific traits or just in recognition of her initial role?
it was just it was in recognition of her original role. And apologies that I've kept walking away from the microphone, Douglas. It was in recognition of her original role. And I think, as I said, she became known among the computer science community through this book, Faster Than Thought by Bodleian. And so she became something of a heroine of that, among that community, before maybe she was recognized among other communities like historians of science and so on. But that was why they wanted to honor a female pioneer. And there's a wonderful correspondence between because the Ada language was created by the American Department of Defense. So they felt they had to write to Ada's descendant, the third or fourth Lord Lytton, to ask for permission to use Ada's name. And there's a wonderful letter back, which should we tactfully say, it's somewhat of its time, in the way it talks about Ada Lovelace. But that was the reason.
Right. Any more questions from the room? Well, in that case, I think it's time to draw the evening to a close. I'm going to hand over to Chris Budd again to thank us.
Well, thank you, Ursula, for giving us such a wonderful insight into the life of, you may not claim it to be, but I think she was the world's first computer scientist, and also showing us that women are still fantastically good, not only at computer science, but also explaining complicated ideas to a general audience. So thank you very much indeed. And we look forward to hearing more computer science from you in the future.